All right, let's get started. Hi, everyone. I'm Eric Brynjolfsson. I'm the director of the Stanford Digital Economy Lab here at Stanford. It's part of the Stanford Institute for Human-Centered AI. And this is our inaugural session of our Digital Economy Seminar Series. We're delighted to have Sinan Aral joining us. In a minute, I'm going to introduce him. But before I do that, I'd like to briefly introduce Christy Coe, our executive director, who's going to say a few things as well. Christy?
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining our first seminar. These are occurring bi-weekly during the academic year. We hope that you guys will all tune in for our future seminars as well. Just a bit of logistics for today's session. We are recording this, as you can see on your screens, and we are really excited to hear your questions for Sinan. So you can see on this slide, you can participate in the Q&A using Slido if you go to sli.do. The event code is 8100, and we'll be making sure that Sinan sees as many of your questions as we possibly can, although there are a lot of you. So just so you know, if we don't get to your question, we're sorry and we will do our best. So I will leave it at that.
Right, and let me just underscore, we really are looking forward to your questions. We'd like to make this as interactive as possible, and Sinan has generously agreed to have a big chunk of the session for Q&A. Let me just say a little bit about Sinan. He is a professor at MIT. He's the director of the MIT Initiative on the Digital Economy. He's here to talk about what may be the most important book of the year. It's called The Hype Machine: How Social Media Disrupts Our Elections, Our Economy, Our Health, and How We Must Adapt. Sinan was a PhD student of mine at MIT, and he's gone on to really become, I think, the most credible and influential researcher understanding how social media is changing the economy and changing society. Something that's obviously extremely topical here as the election's coming up. So Sinan, welcome. Good to have you here.
Thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
So I know you've got some a little bit of background you can share with us. I think we can get you to share your slides. Why don't you present for a bit? I think maybe 20 minutes or so, and then we'll go to Q&A.
Yeah.
Great.
So thanks everyone for attending. It's really great to be here. I know that this community that Eric and Christy and others are building at Stanford is just going to be such an important community to the future of human-centered artificial intelligence, but also to the digital economy. As Eric said, I'm a student of his from back in the day, and it's great also to be here with a close friend and mentor to talk about my first book, which is called The Hype Machine. I have put a link to the book in the chat for those of you who want to check out the book itself. That will take you to my webpage and the specific page for the book. It has a few things that other people are saying about it and links to go get it and so on. So really, I want to keep this very informal. I'm just going to give a whirlwind tour of the book just to give you a sense for what it's about, and would love for this to be about the conversation. So it doesn't just have to be another Zoom talking head in a sea of talking heads. So let me go ahead and do that and go through the whirlwind tour, and then we'll have hopefully a very lively discussion. I've done several of these, and there hasn't been one which hasn't been a very live. I'm expecting something very similar here today. A lot of different topics to cover on this particular social media front. So let me get right into it. If somebody could give me an indication of whether or not they see this. Perfect. All right. Great. So this book is the product of literally 20 years of research and 4 years of writing. I started researching social media 4 years before Facebook was founded, while I was a PhD student at MIT, and I've been researching it ever since. We've conducted some of the largest studies on Twitter, on Facebook, on Yahoo, WhatsApp, WeChat, LinkedIn, and published them in places like Nature and Science and Management Science and many other places. And so what I tried to do in this book is to distill everything that I've learned over the last 20 years of research into a book about how social media is disrupting our world, but much more critically, what we can do to adapt. So many of you have probably now seen the Social Dilemma documentary. You may have read books like Surveillance Capitalism by Shoshana Zuboff or Zucked by Roger McNamee. I highly recommend all of these. The movie, the Social Dilemma is now in a long line of sort of anti-social media movies. Before it, there was The Great Hack about the Cambridge Analytica scandal and so on. Really, I wanted this book to take off where those books and movies leave off, which is, what do we do? What can we concretely do to fix the social media crisis that we find ourselves in, and if we took a rigorous and nuanced scientific approach to fixing this problem? I'll also mention that I'm an active entrepreneur and an investor. I've built and sold 2 companies in this space and have co-founded and now run a venture capital firm that also invests in this space. And so I'm able to see this not from just a research perspective, but also from the perspective of an entrepreneur and an investor. And for those of you who read the book, you'll see those 3 perspectives highlighted throughout. So the easiest place to start with this is the elections, obviously. So if you think back to 2016 and the role of Russian interference in the 2016 election, Russia spread manipulative messages to 126 million people on Facebook, 20 million people on Instagram, 10 million tweets to accounts with 6 million followers on Twitter, and 43 hours of YouTube content. And just 30 days or so before possibly the most consequential election of our time, we are seeing very similar but much more advanced efforts by Russia and a little bit by China and Iran as well. So Russia is much more advanced now than they were in 2016. They are nudging real American citizens to spread misinformation rather than impersonating them to get around platform policies against inauthentic accounts. They've moved their servers to the United States in order to avoid domestic surveillance because legally our intelligence community has a harder time surveilling domestically. They've infiltrated Iran's cyber war department, perhaps to launch attacks made to look like they came from Tehran. And this is all happening during a global pandemic when there's civil unrest in the streets arising from the justifiable social movements around police brutality in the United States. There's a lot of uncertainty and lots of questions about in-person voting, about mail-in voting, about whether the president, if he loses, will accept the results of the election. It is a very dangerous moment for misinformation during an election, but also in the immediate aftermath of the election. But it's not just about democracy and elections. So in April 2013, the AP Press put out this tweet, which said, "Breaking, 2 explosions in the White House and Barack Obama is injured." This was retweeted 4,000 times in 5 minutes, and then it went viral thereafter. But this wasn't real news. This was actually Syrian hackers who had infiltrated the AP Twitter handle and put out this false tweet. The problem with the hype machine, which is the social media industrial complex, as I call it or define it in the book, is that it's linked to other systems that we've built. For instance, automated trading algorithms that trade on the sentiment that is being expressed in social media, in this case, over Twitter. And when the trading algorithms got hold of this tweet, they immediately started selling stocks, and it caused the stock market to crash, wiping out nearly $140 billion in equity value in a matter of minutes. And that's just from one tweet. Imagine we see trillions of tweets a day, and imagine the effects on moving markets, moving the outcomes of businesses, not just equities, but also enterprises, both large and small. It's obviously not just about elections and the economy, it's also about our public health. So we're seeing a lot of COVID-19 misinformation, from hoax cures to origin stories, whether it was made in a lab in China, whether it was made by the United States. It's part of political intrigue about who's blaming who for the virus. But in my mind, the most significant misinformation is around the vaccine. So at the IDE at MIT, we are fielding the largest global behaviors, perceptions, and norms surveys about COVID in collaboration with Facebook and the WHO. And one of the things that we're tracking is vaccine confidence. That is, are you confident in a vaccine? Would you take it if one was released? And we are tracking how that's going up and down as misinformation about COVID is spreading. For instance, when Russia announced the Sputnik vaccine, it caused a dramatic decrease in vaccine confidence. If people are not confident and don't take the vaccine, it could dramatically impact the trajectory of the pandemic. But before COVID, it was measles that was the subject of this kind of misinformation. For those of you who don't know, measles is an incredibly deadly disease, incredibly contagious, way more contagious than coronavirus. In the year 2000, it was eradicated in the United States. In 2010, there were only 63 cases of measles in the US. In 2019, there were 1,250 in just the first 6 months of the year, and they were concentrated in communities like Rockland County, New York, and Clark County, Washington. But the thing is that when you look at the data on the ad buys for anti-vaccine content on Facebook, you see that it's targeted at women of mother age in exactly these communities like Rockland County, New York, and Clark County, Washington. In the book, I detail the relationship between anti-vaccine content on social media and outbreaks of not just measles, but also coronavirus and what it means for our public health. And this is really about the hype machine, what I call the social media industrial complex. It's Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Snapchat, WeChat, Pinterest, and the rest of it. But it's also all the third-party data providers and targeting firms and all of the users of social media and the policymakers that are trying to regulate it. But this isn't just a doom and gloom story. The hype machine, social media, also holds the potential for tremendous promise. So when Nepal experienced its greatest earthquake in 100 years, Europe donated $3 million to disaster relief. The United States donated $10 million, and Facebook spun up a Donate Now button and raised 15.5 million people, more than Europe and the US combined, from 770,000 people in 175 countries, which just underscores the mobilization potential of this kind of technology and the way that it can change hearts and minds as well as behaviors. It certainly has a big role to play in social movements around the world. We're seeing it as an accelerant and an enabler of the Black Lives Matter movement. But before that, it was the Arab Spring, the snow revolution in Russia, protests in Hong Kong, in Ukraine, and I detail both the power and the fragility of the use of social media in social movements like this today. Another silly example, which underscores how powerful this is the ice bucket challenge. Something so silly as dousing yourself with ice water raised $250 million with a B in 8 weeks for ALS research, again underscoring how much potential this technology has to do good in the world. It also creates a tremendous amount of economic opportunity. Research conducted both at MIT by Eric and his colleagues, as well as at Stanford by Matthew Genskow and Hunt Alcott, estimated that Facebook creates $370 billion every year in consumer surplus in the US alone. And that's just in the US. Imagine that worldwide. In some countries, Facebook is the internet, like in the Philippines and in parts of Africa. It is the access to jobs and economic transactions, the way that small and medium-sized businesses do business at all. Access to reskilling, access to meaningful human connections, access to life-saving health information, and so on. Obviously, before the COVID pandemic, social media was a pariah. You had Sacha Baron Cohen calling it the greatest propaganda machine in history in his keynote at the Anti-Defamation League. You had movies like The Great Hack, now followed by The Social Dilemma. You have the Delete Facebook movement, now followed by the Stop Hate for Profit movement, you have the Cambridge Analytica scandal, and so on. But once COVID hit, we were all forced off the streets and indoors and onto our laptops, and all of these services broke records, every single one of them. Lots of digital Luddites who had never been on social media are now on social media, and many of them are likely to stay. Mark Zuckerberg was quoted as saying, "We're just trying to keep the lights on over here." So COVID really created a 180 from the pariah status of social media to something that was our only source of meaningful human connection for many months, as well as life-saving information and all of the news that people rely on through social media. However, obviously, it still holds the tremendous the promise for tremendous peril, as we've seen since COVID in election misinformation and everything that we've been discussing. The point of the book is that we're at a crossroads now. We're at a crossroads between privacy and insecurity, between free speech on one hand and hate speech or harmful speech on the other, between truth and falsity. We've conducted some of the largest studies of the spread of false news online, which we can get into in the Q&A. We're at a crossroads between democracy and authoritarianism, between meaningful human connection on one hand and political polarization that might be driven by filter bubbles and echo chambers in social media. I obviously evaluate all the scientific evidence for and against that in terms of political polarization and affective polarization in the United States and globally in the book as well. So we're at this crossroads, and it's really about this technology, which didn't exist almost 10 years ago. And there's a chapter, chapter 4 in the book is called Your Brain on Social Media. And I try to build our understanding of social media from first principles. And this chapter is all about the neuroscience of social media, how it works under the hood to affect our brains. So for instance, human brains are some of the largest relative to body weight of any species on the planet, as well as the neocortex ratio, which is the ratio of the neocortex to the rest of the brain. Again, some of the largest of any species on the planet. And one of the leading hypotheses for why this is the case is known as the social brain hypothesis, that our brains grew so large in essence to process social signals. So humans are fifth order intentional. So if I know that Joe is African, that's first order intentional. If I know that Sally knows, that Jim knows, that Bill knows, that Bob knows that Joe is African, that's fifth order intentional. We can think about what's in the brains of humans 5 hops away from us in the social network. It was long thought that humans were the only species that was fifth order intentional. It's now thought that maybe one species of ape or two may also be fifth order intentional. But the point of the hypothesis is that human brains evolved to process social signals, and then we created and scaled a technology across the entire planet that delivers trillions of these social signals in likes, comments, shares, posts, what your cousin ate for dinner on Instagram last night, in the trillions in real-time live streaming of the social signals of millions of people. When you put it in that context, the meteoric rise of social media is no surprise, because it's like tossing a lit match into a pool of gasoline neurologically. This chapter also goes into the dopamine reward system, how social media is designed for our brains. So Sean Parker told Mike Allen in 2017 that, yeah, we designed it to give you a little dopamine hit every time you got a like or a comment on your content to keep you coming back for more. That's why it is, in essence, addictive, because of the dopamine rush that we get, combined with the variable reinforcement schedule, meaning we don't know when the next dopamine hit is coming from a notification or our phones buzzing or vibrating. So we're always looking at our phones. Is it going to buzz now? Is it going to light up now? That's by design. And the chapter ends with the neurological foundations of behavior change, which is, how do social media messages and signals affect our brains in a way that is a precursor to our behavior changing? And then the rest of the book is about, how does social media change our behavior in the voting booth, when we're buying products, who we date, what we read, what we believe. Just a tidbit that might get your mind wandering about what social media will do for the rest of human evolution. Relationships, romantic relationships created by algorithms on social dating apps surpassed relationships created by traditional means, friend-to-friend introductions or in person, in 2013. And frequently on these dating apps, you don't get a browsing choice. You get an up or down decision on what the algorithm gives you. So the question then becomes, how are the matches being created by the algorithms different than what the matches were created in traditional ways? And what does that mean for our gene pool, diversity of our children's genetics and human evolution in general? Obviously still an open question, really driven by algorithms. The chapter immediately after this one goes deep into the economics of the technology, which is all about network effects. Specifically, a little known paper by Jeffrey Rolfs, written in 1974, which foreshadowed Facebook's go-to-market strategy that it used to defeat MySpace, which is really all based on local and targeting highly clustered groups of densely connected individuals to really turbocharge local network effects. I really lay this out because it's essential to understand the economics of the technology if you're going to answer questions like, should we break up Facebook, and what effect will that have as a solution to privacy or free speech versus hate speech or misinformation. The third component is the notion of lock-in. Obviously, we are not able to take our data or our social networks with us, so we're locked into these walled gardens, and that's creating a lot of the outcomes we see today, and I'll get more into that in just a minute. The book goes under the hood of social media to really describe how it works technologically, and one of the main things it describes is what I call the hype loop, which is the dynamic interplay between machine intelligence on one hand and human behavior on the other. The machine analyzes our behavior and optimizes a system that is essentially maximizing profit through engagement in an attention economy because it sells ads as precursors to persuasion. The machine then gives us recommendations for what to read, who to friend, and what to buy. We take those suggestions and we discard some of them and we go with some of them. And then what we choose is then fed back into the machine. And this loop between machine intelligence and human behavior really does explain a tremendous amount of the variance in the outcomes that we see in society. The framework of the book is that you have these digital social networks connected to always on smartphones with this hype loop creating the outcomes that we see, leading to three trends: personalized mass persuasion, hyper socialization of society, and an attention economy, which creates a tyranny of trends. But the thing I want to point out in this framework are the four levers that we have to steer this technology towards calmer waters and away from the impending rocks, which are money, code, norms, and laws. Money refers to the business models, which creates the incentives for the way that platforms behave, as well as the way that advertisers and users behave on the platforms. The code is the design of the platforms and the algorithms that run them, the friend suggestion algorithms and the newsfeed algorithms, which I go into in great detail. The norms is how we appropriate and adopt this technology, the norms that we use in using the technology. And finally, the laws, how we regulate the market failures created by the hype machine. Obviously, regulation is a big question mark right now. Perhaps the biggest question mark is, should we break up big tech? Which I think is kind of a misnomer, because if you really dig into it, each of these antitrust cases is very different between Amazon, Apple, Facebook, Google, and so on. In the case of Facebook, the idea is to break up Facebook in order to solve market failures like privacy, free speech versus hate speech, misinformation, election integrity, and so on. I take a very strong position on this in the book, which is to essentially say that breaking up Facebook will not solve any of these market failures. And in fact, it does nothing to alter the underlying economics of the social media economy, which runs on network effects. Network effects tend towards monopolies and tend toward concentration because the rich get richer. And if you don't create structural reforms in the social media economy, you will just tip the next Facebook-like company into market dominance because of network effects. What I argue is that we need social network portability, data portability, and legislated interoperability. We have things like the Access Act sitting in front of Congress as we speak, which I think is an essential structural reform that needs to happen in order to reduce market concentration and really create competition in this industry. I do believe that competition is the entry ticket to solving the market failures that we have. Once we create competition through social network portability, identity portability, and interoperability, then we need to address each of the market failures in turn, including, for instance, privacy. We can learn a lot from the successes and failures of GDPR. I think GDPR is an interesting piece of legislation that does some good things and has some costs as well that we could avoid. But we're going to have to, at some point, harmonize the 50 states' privacy laws. I believe that we'll see federal privacy legislation. The question is, what will it look like? Will it take advantages of the benefits of things like GDPR and avoid the costs? Obviously, we've written a lot about how we harden our democracy and specifically protect our elections to social media manipulation. This is a paper I wrote with Dean Eccles in Science about that topic, and we can talk about that. And the main theme of the book is very simple. The idea, the main message is we can achieve the promise of social media, all of those great sort of potential for promise that I described earlier for social mobilization and so on, while avoiding the peril. And the hype machine, the book, describes how we must do that by getting past the armchair theorizing about social media and getting rigorous about the science under the hood of social media to inform what we do next. So I will stop there, and hopefully we can have a discussion from here on out. Thanks.
Thanks, Sinan. That was a fire hose of information and insight. Thank you for sharing all of that. And obviously, there's a lot more in the book that you put in the chat there. There's a lot of hooks to follow up on, and I see questions popping up on Slido. I encourage people to add your questions or upvote the questions that you like that are already there. But let me start with one of the comments you made in your talk about how we're at a crossroads. Number of choices. One was between truth and falsity. I mean, maybe the most important function of an information infrastructure like the internet is sharing information, but that becomes dysfunctional if the information that's being shared is false or fake. You wrote this landmark paper with Deb Roy and Sarush Bazogi a couple of years ago. Made the cover of the journal Science about the spread of true and false news online. And what really striking and disturbing result was that false news actually spreads a lot faster than truth. So that's not what we were hoping for. Maybe you can see a little bit about why that is and what, if anything, we can do about it.
Yeah, so we studied all of the true and false verified stories that ever spread on Twitter from 2006 to 2017, 10 years of data. We had access to the Twitter Historical Archive in direct collaboration with Twitter. And what we found, as you said, was that false news traveled farther, faster, deeper, and more broadly than the truth in every category of information, sometimes by an order of magnitude. And of course, the natural next question when you see a scary result like that is why? Why is false news spreading so much farther, faster, deeper, and more broadly than the truth? And our original conjecture was that, well, maybe people who spread false news are just different. Maybe they have more followers, or maybe they follow more people, or maybe they are more active, they tweet more often, or maybe they're more often verified users of Twitter or have been on Twitter longer. And we checked each one of those in turn, and what we found was the exact opposite, that false news spreaders had fewer followers, followed fewer people, were less active, less often verified, and less time on Twitter. And so false news was spreading farther, faster, deeper, and more broadly than the truth, despite these characteristics, not because of them. So we had to come up with another explanation. And what we came up with was something we call the novelty hypothesis. So if you read the cognitive science literature, it tells you that human attention is drawn to novelty. And if you read the sociology literature, what you find is that we gain in status when we share novel information because it makes it seem like we're in the know or that we have access to inside information that other people don't have. And so both of these led us to conjecture that maybe false news is surprising and novel. So we used some information theoretic measures of novelty to check whether false news was more novel than the truth compared to what people had seen in the 60 days prior to receiving a true or false news tweet. And indeed, across all three measures that we used of mutual information and other types of novelty, false news was much more novel. But we weren't satisfied with that, because maybe it's more novel in some highfalutin information theoretic sense, but maybe people don't perceive it as more novel. So we checked the replies to true and false tweets, and we looked at the sentiment expressed in the replies to the true and false tweets. And what we found was that replies to false tweets express significantly more surprise and anger and disgust. So it's salacious, it's shocking, it's kind of shock and awe, surprising, shocking, and blood boiling. Replies to truth expressed anticipation, joy, and trust. And so this is a leading indicator of why false news spreads so much faster.
So in a way, I mean, yeah, I can see how that works. I mean, it's a lot easier to be shocking if you're not constrained by the truth. I mean, the truth, most of it is pretty predictable. And so something that's really unbelievable, well, you know, lies are more likely to be unbelievable, or they have less constraints.
Yeah, it's hard to get out ahead of false news because it could come from anywhere, right? It's unconstrained, as you say, to any semblance of reality. It's totally made up. In addition, since it travels so much faster than the truth, debunking information it's never catching up in a way that cleans up false news once it's already gotten out.
What can we do? Actually, one of the other interesting results in there was the role of bots in fake news. Another counterintuitive result, if you want to just explain that. Maybe get it
so at the time that we published this paper, there was a lot of congressional testimony that bots were responsible for the spread of false news. So we checked this, and what we found, we identified all the bots and we took them out and we put them back in. And what we found was that they could not explain this differential diffusion of false news compared to the truth. But what we found was this really incredibly interesting symbiosis of bot and human activity. So you may have seen, some of you may have seen the cover of Science, where we have this picture of a false news tweet where there's a starburst explosion at the very beginning, and then kind of these additional long retweet chains looking like tendrils of a jellyfish emanating from the starburst pattern. It turns out what happens is that bots jump on it early, retweet it a lot, and then mention humans, specifically politicians, celebrities. And then once human beings start retweeting it, it sort of launders it, legitimizes it, and spreads it on through the social network. So the spread of false news is really this interesting symbiosis between bots and humans, where bots cannot explain the spread of false news at the rate that it spreads by itself.
And so what can we do about it then? You know, it's not enough to shut down the bots.
Yeah. So essentially, in the book, I go through about 5 or 6 broad approaches that we need to be taking in order to fight falsity online. So we've been doing a ton of research, and I have to give a ton of credit here to David Rand, Gordon Pennycook, Dean Eccles, and others who are really looking now at experimental analysis of interventions to stop the spread of false news. And what we're finding at the MIT IDE is that being reflective will reduce people's belief in false news and sharing of false news. So nudges to be reflective can not only reduce belief, but reduce sharing. And one way to nudge is to ask people every so often in their newsfeed, hey, is this headline accurate? And when they do that, it forces them to reflect on whether what they're reading is accurate. And it's been shown that that will carry on to the next post and the next post and the next post. At the same time, if you scale that nudge, you're collecting labels of veracity from the crowd that can then be massaged with machine intelligence and the 35,000 employees that Facebook employs now to also try to moderate fake news, to label falsity. And if you think about labeling, it's an important, scalable, crowdsourceable solution. When we consume food that we buy at the grocery store, it's extensively labeled by law. We know how many calories it has, how many trans fats, if it's produced in a facility that produces wheat or peanuts, if you have an allergy. But we have nothing like that in terms of labels for the information that we're consuming and putting in our brains. But that kind of information can help us be reflective and can make us think twice about whether we should share it. In addition, we should be demonetizing fake news, so you can't earn ad dollars against fake content. We should be demoting false public health information and search results. We should be slowing the resharing of information in general. WhatsApp limited reshares to 5, then 1 to reduce the spread of coronavirus misinformation. That slows down information in general to allow truth to catch up with falsity. There should be legislation around political advertising. We obviously regulate political speech, but it's not as well regulated on social media. So there are a number of different things that we can be doing about falsity.
Well, picking up on the revenue model side, Chuck Easley has a question. Is there a potentially viable business model out there for social media that doesn't rely on selling data to advertisers and that could actually preserve users' privacy? And just to extend that a little bit, maybe you can also link it back to what that might do about the types of content that's created.
Yeah, so this is a big question. One of the leading candidates is obviously the subscription model. But just to clarify, most of these platforms do not sell data to advertisers. What they do is they do the targeting for you, and they charge you a pretty penny for that service. But you're right that they do use very detailed personal data to do that targeting. And that is a privacy concern in the same way that selling data might be. They do make data available to third parties, but because of what I describe in the book as the transparency paradox that really came to a head with the Cambridge Analytica scandal, that has largely created a tension between security on one hand and transparency on the other. And they've opted more for the security and privacy approach in terms of giving away data or selling data, but the targeting still happens. Now, when it comes to the leading alternative business model, which is subscriptions, the one thing that you have to think about there is the tremendous amount of consumer surplus that's created by this being free services, especially in terms of inequality. So not everyone can afford even the $9 or $10 a month that we pay, for instance, for Netflix subscriptions. And when we're talking about access in the Philippines or in parts of Africa, where really Facebook is the internet, it could create a tremendous amount of inequality. An answer to that might be tiered pricing or some sort of progressive pricing, but that really becomes tricky. I think that there are other ways, and I also think that we have to question whether that is a realistic approach. In other words, to either legislatively force or to somehow convince the platforms to give up on the advertising business model. I'm not sure legislating that is a good alternative. I'm not a big fan of the government being that deep into market functions. And
one step back a little, just
sure.
Implicit, I think, in Chuck's question, I've heard people say that advertising leads to lower quality content or more fake news or other, I guess, privacy violations. Do you see that? Do you see that the advertising model is worse on any or all of those dimensions? I mean, we could go through each of them in turn, or just is there an argument for this being a bad revenue model?
Well, I mean, I think that the argument for it being a bad revenue model is the notion of the tie into it is this notion of the attention economy running on engagement, and therefore the algorithms favoring, not by choice saying, I want to favor salacious content, but that the salacious content happens to be revenue maximizing because it's the most short-term engaging and therefore short-term profit maximizing from an engagement standpoint.
Kind of like getting kind of in system 1, system 2, you
right.
kind of see something, you click on it, you don't have to think about, am I going to pay for this? It's just there.
Exactly. And so if people pay, the argument goes that if people paid a subscription, then Facebook would be less concerned about engagement, short-term engagement, every minute, clicking, maximizing clicks and therefore favoring salacious content. I don't think it's that black and white. I'm not sure that Facebook still wouldn't want engagement to reduce churn, that they would want to give you the stuff that gives you the dopamine hits, because that's what keeps you coming back for more, and that's going to be correlated with less churn. What I do think, however, is there's a big difference between short-run profit maximization and long-run profit maximization here. I think the successful leaders of the new social age will be the ones that realize that in the long run, the alignment of the platform's values and society's values is actually more long-run profit maximizing, because we see huge backlash now, both from employees of Facebook jumping ship, the delete Facebook movement, the Stop Hate for Profit movement. And yes, these are drops in the bucket of the bottom line of Facebook today. But the zeitgeist in society is a massive backlash against all of the pollution, if you will, as an analogy, all of the negative externalities that are being created by social media. And I think that in the long run, that's not going to be profit maximizing either. And so managing the churn and backlash element with the short run engagement and click maximizing benefit of it is going to be important for these platform leaders. To answer Chuck's question, it's not clear to me that the subscription model immediately, black and white, no questions asked, solves the engagement to salacious content problem. And it creates other problems like inequality in access to life-saving health information, to economic opportunity, and so on. It's not clear that it's realistic, and it's not clear exactly what a progressive version of the subscription model would look like either.
Well, your comment that there may be, taking into account the long-term profit maximization may lead to a different set of choices is a good lead into Gabriel Weintraub's question. You get hired as the head of product for Facebook. What do you do in the first 90 days to combat fake news and misinformation, and maybe to make it a better platform? By the way, I hope that doesn't happen. You're too valuable in academia, but I wouldn't be surprised if it did happen.
So, I think the first 5 or 6 things that I would emphasize would be what I described. And if I'm head of product rather than head of revenue, for instance, those are exactly the types of things that I would push. So first would be scaling nudges of reflectivity that also collect labels of accuracy, followed by crowdsource plus machine intelligence plus human in the loop moderation, creating more provenance labels on the information that we're consuming to allow us to have something to be reflective about when we're consuming information. Reducing the speed with which resharing occurs, demonetizing fake news, reducing the ranking of fake news in search results.
So just to be clear, it sounds on the surface, a lot of these would have at least a short-term revenue hit, wouldn't they? I mean, they seem like in the short run, you're taking away some revenue, but you see that as in the long run being a positive?
I'm not 100% sure. I mean, one thing that we know about these platforms is that there are a tremendous amount of experiments that can be run, multi-armed bandits that can find the options that maximize against those two constraints simultaneously, maximize revenue subject to the constraint of minimizing fake news, for instance.
The short term versus long term, I think.
Well, the short term versus long term is that's where you'd have to give me the dual role of head of revenue and product, right. Because I would argue as head of revenue that we need to take a much more long term perspective. I mean, the Facebook.
But these experiments, one of the biases that experiments have, and you know this a lot better than I do, is that they give you quick feedback, but they don't necessarily tell you whether someone's going to be there a year from now, and whether or not that they just get disgusted with the platform.
Well, it's funny. We are working, and our PhD student Jeremy Yang is focused on experiments to understand long-term outcomes of multi-armed bandits. And we're working on the experimentation infrastructure that would be able to identify long-term outcomes and proxies for long-term outcomes. So I do believe that there are experimental methods that get at long-term outcomes. I think that there's a choice to be made that's much more fundamental than whether you can measure the effect on long-term outcomes. Certainly those long-term outcomes are noisier. You can use proxies for long-term outcomes that are fairly predictive of long-term outcomes, which is kind of the method that Jeremy is taking. Right. But the much more important question is, do you consider and even favor long-term outcomes? Does that gel with your duty in your own mind to shareholder value? And my argument would be definitively yes, because Facebook is facing an existential crisis. The question isn't whether you can polish the apple even more in the next 3 quarters. The question is, are you going to survive in the next 3 to 5 years? If I was a shareholder of Facebook, I would want the leadership answering that second question, not that first question.
Yeah, there are, not surprising, a bunch of questions. I'm going to try and get a few more of them in the next 10 minutes or so. Here's one from David Gonzalez. The European Commission, you mentioned GDPR earlier, but the European Commission will soon propose a Digital Services Act, including regulation for social media. In the draft legislation, the EC also portrays the platforms as gatekeepers of an ecosystem of business and opportunity. Do you agree with this approach?
Well, I'd have to look more into the details of that exact draft legislation. I have seen sort of the broad-based contours of it. One thing that I really like about what I've seen so far is this focus on interoperability. So let me just talk about that for 2 seconds.
Yeah, there's all those questions about interoperability.
Yeah, so let me kind of kill both of those birds with this one stone, which is essentially that what I'm talking about here and what I refer to the Access Act, which would force social media platforms greater than 100 million users to become interoperable, is essentially like number portability in the cell phone market.
Yeah, that's the analogy that sometimes made, including by John Gaunt here.
Yeah, exactly. So he wrote this amazing piece for the Hamilton Project, which was really laid out very nicely the argument of identity, what he calls identity portability, which I talk about in the book. And the basic idea here is very similar to number portability. So it used to be that you couldn't take your cell phone number from Verizon to Sprint, and that was your social network because everyone who knew you knew to call you at that number. So it was analogous to taking your social network with you from Verizon to Sprint. You can imagine something similar here, being able to message across social networks and being able to take your networks with you through interoperability from one network to the other. When Europe imposed number portability back in early 2000, it created $880 million of consumer surplus every single quarter and really decreased the concentration in the market. When instant messaging, AOL, you might remember AOL had AOL Instant Messaging, AIM was the dominant player, was forced to become interoperable with Yahoo Messenger and MSN Messenger. It reduced its market share from 65% to something like 59% in a year, then 55% the year after, and then it steadily lost market share until it ceded the entire market to Facebook and Google and so on. There are great precedents for this kind of interoperability really solving the concentration problem. I don't think that breaking up Facebook will have the same effect. I'll also say, let me add one other thing, which is that the consumer surplus that is created by networks like Facebook comes from the network effects. So if you were to disentangle and break up these networks without making them interoperable, you would essentially destroy that value without solving any of the competition problems you're trying to solve. So I think that breaking up Facebook is kind of like putting a Band-Aid on a tumor. I'm okay with breaking up Facebook as long as you do the structural reforms first, leave the market, the consumer surplus creating network effects intact, and reduce the concentration effects of network effects.
Right. No, I think you make a very good point that, you know, we as consumers get huge benefits. I want to be able to see my cousins' photos and whatever, and they may be, so it wouldn't make sense for them to be in non-interoperable networks. But and having them interoperable, I can see the huge benefit to that. But is it privately beneficial? Your example of AOL was that they lost market share. And I remember with the number portability that the phone companies, they were saying, oh, we could never do this. You know, our servers are going to melt down if we had to like move the number to another company. They obviously didn't have an incentive to make things number. They preferred to have a lot of separate monopolies. So is this a situation where you can't rely on the free market to get to the right solution? You need to have regulation.
Correct. We have a series of obvious market failures here, including all of the externalities that aren't priced into any of the business models of the platforms, like fake news, unless there's a big enough backlash to shut down Facebook, like privacy, as well as competition, clearly deriving abnormal rents from concentration is privately beneficial to any given platform. We do need government regulation, but we need nuanced and smart government regulation here rather than ad hoc and politically served government regulation.
Great. So here's a question from Daniel Rock, who you know well. Is the research mapping the sharing to the belief behaviors? In other words, what's the balance between signals via sharing falsehoods versus genuine belief? And you can with the QAnon people.
Yes. So the answer, broadly speaking, and we'd have to go into each rabbit hole individually, the broad answer is yes. So we have done experiments for the last 20 years, randomized experiments looking at the behavior changes created by social media messages in shopping behavior, voting behavior, exercise behavior, dating behavior. And in every single one of those, it's clear that messages delivered over social media change behaviors dramatically, statistically significantly. There were very large-scale voter experiments done by Facebook in 2010 and 2012. There were many different advertising experiments done by us and others, exercise, natural experiments on effects on exercise behavior, dating behavior, and so on. And all of these experiments show statistically significant and economically and socially significant behavior change from social media messaging. And it is reflected also in the neuroscience data as well, where people are put into fMRI machines. They are brain scanned when looking at social media messages. Those brain scans predict their behavior better than they do, as well as better than the experts do. And the interesting thing there is that some of the behavior change that the brain scans predict are counterintuitive and surprising compared to what people might predict. So there is very good reason to believe that this changes behavior in dramatic ways in very important contexts.
What are some of the counterintuitive examples they have?
Yeah, so for instance, there have been studies done on advertisements, social media messaging to get people to call the 1-800 Quit Now smoking cancer hotline, done by my friend and colleague Emily Falk at the University of Pennsylvania, as well as many other great studies. If you want to dig into the neuroscience, she's really a good person to look at. She's been doing this stuff for a long time. And so most people think that certain types of advertisements are going to be the most effective to get people to call. So for instance, whether it's the ones that are sort of cringe-inducing tracheotomy advertisements versus, an advertisement of an older person being able to walk with their kids. What the experts and what the people believe is the exact opposite of what the brain scans predict is going to work. And the brain scans end up being much better at predicting across different regions in the United States upticks in calls to the cancer hotline where different advertisements were shown.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. We don't have a lot of time. Here's a provocative one. Some of the problems described here in the United States that don't exist in social media in China because of the quote unique unquote ways that Chinese government manages or censors their social media Are there any useful lessons that can be learned from their strategy?
Yeah, absolutely. One really interesting lesson comes from the chatbot Tay. Microsoft released Tay in the United States and in Europe, as well as in China. And in the United States and in Europe, it was inundated with racist, sexist, pro-Hitler, pro-Nazi speech.
Just explain a little bit about how Tay
Yeah,
works.
so Tay was a chatbot on Twitter that essentially had conversations with people. And as people had conversations,
it's fully automated, yeah.
Fully automated chatbot. As people had conversations with her, she evolved her language to reply in ways that reflected what she heard from people. And this is a big point I make in the book, which is that there is a big belief that in technological determinism, Elon Musk says that AI is going to destroy the world, humanity. And, there are a lot of people that sort of blame the technology. But one point I make in the book is that we kind of get out of this technology what we put into it. And Tay is a perfect example. In Europe, when we put into it a lot of hate speech, we got back a lot of hate speech. In China, it is censored, and there wasn't the same problem with the exact same technology. Now, before anybody lights up the chat, I do not advocate censorship. In fact, I am quite the opposite. I'm very much in favor of free speech in this book, but it really does prove the point. There's a lesson to be learned there from the Chinese versus the liberal democratic experience of social media, which highlights how much we really do get out of this technology, what we put into it. We need, and I describe how we will achieve a free speech environment while at the same time avoiding mishaps like Tay. It has to do with the code, how they're designed, the algorithms, but also the norms, how we use these technologies. For instance, on Reddit, there was an experiment done where randomly norms or rules of the road were placed on different subreddits randomly. And when there were these norms posted at the top of the subreddit, it not only decreased antagonistic hate speech, sexist speech, and trolling, but it also increased new user contributions by 70% just by posting a community norms in the subreddit compared to the ones where community norms weren't posted. So the way we adopt the technology really matters. The way we design the technology really matters. And both of those determine what we get out of it.
We are just about out of time. I'm going to take my moderator's privilege to ask you two questions that you'll have trouble answering in a minute, but you can try. The first one is, you started the talk with what happened in the election in 2016. I'd like to hear your brief prediction about what kind of chaos or calmness we're due for in the next 30 days. And then secondly, perhaps most importantly, what specifically can we do? We talked about what the regulators can do and our Congress can speak. What are the things that all of us as individuals can do to address the challenges that you taught us about?
Yeah, well, let me narrow that second question to fake news in the election, just to make it answerable in a minute. So the answer to your first question is, I'm very worried. I'm very worried even more about the misinformation that is inevitably going to be spread around the uncertainty around the election. It's going to be spread by Russia and others, and what effect that will have on people's trust in democracy, people's taking to the streets to protest the election results, to view them as either legitimate or illegitimate. And what happens, I think we have never faced a challenge like this in our democracy in the United States before. This is a perfect storm of circumstances combined with an unpreparedness between 2016 and 2020. We have not gotten ourselves together in preparation to deal with this in the last 4 years. And I'm very worried about what happens next, specifically around misinformation about the election results and what the aftermath of the election, what that portends for the aftermath of the election. That is my greatest fear with regard to misinformation and the election, much less so than the effect of Russian misinformation on changing people's votes. I think it's going to have a bigger effect on voter turnout than vote choice, and all of the evidence that I describe in the book points to that. But I'm most worried about what happens to our trust in democracy, as well as to the post-election outcome of transitions of power and so on in the election. What can we do specifically about fake news in the election? 4 easy things. One is that whenever I see misinformation about the election come across my social media, it's usually preceded by the preamble, I don't know if this is true, but it's really interesting if it is, and then we share it. We got to stop doing that. It is designed to be really interesting if it's true, but it's not, and that's the point of it. Second is the 80-20 rule applies to fake news. A lot of it can be debunked with just a few Google searches and clicks, and just a few first links on Google debunk a very large swath of the fake news. Third is check your emotional pulse. It's designed to be salacious and make your blood boil. If you feel that way upon reading it, say, wait a minute, is this real? And do that Google search. And then finally, check the original source. Sometimes, a lot of times, this fake news is masquerading as real news, but it's obviously fake news websites and can be just ferreted out by looking at the URL. There's a lot of typos and all cap writing and so on.
Well, thanks, Sinan. That was just amazing. Really appreciate you kicking off our seminar series. It couldn't have been a better person to start it. Let me just tell everybody that we'll be having another one of these in about 2 weeks, or in 2 weeks. I also want to let people know about our AI and the Future of Work conference coming up on October 27th, starting at 9:15 a.m. Pacific time. Some of the speakers include Condi Rice, Fei-Fei Li, Reid Hoffman, Eric Schmidt, Governor Gina Raimondo, James Manyika, Mary Kay Henry, Susan Athey, Mark Tessier-Levine, the president of Stanford, Gillian Tett, Mark Duggan, and a whole host of researchers who are contributing their work. So look for information about that, the AI and the Future of Work conference on October 27th. Thanks, everybody, and we look forward to seeing you all again in 2 weeks, and especially thanks to you, Sinan.
Thanks, everyone.